Spider-Man is one of the most iconic superheroes of all time, standing alongside greats like Batman and Superman. Whether it's ink on a page or action on the silver screen, all three are stars of some of the most beloved stories in comics, cartoons, and movies. But this is GameSpot, so what about those dang video games? Batman saw huge success in Rocksteady's Arkham series, and Superman? Well, his games sure have a ring to them. And as for Spider-Man, well, the webhead's been in dozens of games throughout the years, some memorable, others, not so much.
Giant lizards!
And with the upcoming release of Insomniac's Spider-Man game, I thought I'd swing through memory lane and cover 4 decades of our friendly neighborhood wall crawler to see how exactly he got to 2018.
I'll blow this town to smithereens! Time bomb! Try to get up there in time, Spider-Man!
Watch me cut my web, Goblin!
Let's start in 1982 on the Atari 2600. Not only was this the year Spidey would make his video game debut, but it was also the first game based on any Marvel Comics character. Published by Parker Brothers, the 2600 Spider-Man game asked players to don the red and blue suit and foiled the Green Goblin's devilish plans. As is the case for many 2600 titles, the gameplay is quite simple. As the web slinger, you must scale a building and defuse bombs. The trick, however, is that Spider-Man can't do whatever a spider can, which includes crawling up the wall. Instead, you can only use webs to move vertically or diagonally. Once you reach the top of the building, you'll find the Green Goblin and his super bomb, which you must defuse to defeat him. While the game does feature pretty good renditions of both Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, it's lacking in actual combat. You don't fight the Green Goblin, trap him in your webs, or anything of the sort. To beat him, you just have to avoid him. In fact, it would be quite a while before fans would actually get to throw a punch in a Spider-Man video game. Spidey's next digital adventure came in the form of 1984's Quest Probe Spider-Man, which was a text-based game that released on various home computers. Developed by Adventure International, Quest Probe was a trilogy of graphical text adventure games starring Marvel characters like the Hulk, Human Torch and the Thing, and Spider-Man. Gameplay consisted of the player typing out inputs that they wanted Spider-Man to perform. There was even a game plan for the X-Men, though Adventure International went bankrupt before it could see the light of day. And that brings us to 1989, the year we could finally fight as Spider-Man. The Amazing Spider-Man and Captain America in Doctor Doom's Revenge released for the Commodore 64 and other personal computers. It's an arcade-style side-scrolling beat-em-up where you swap between the Webhead and Captain America. And in addition to Doctor Doom, it saw you fight classic Marvel baddies such as the Hobgoblin, Electro, and an enraged Hulk, who was actually Mysterio in disguise all along. Unfortunately, as cool as it may sound, the game was criticized for its unresponsive controls, overall slow gameplay, and weak story. Now, before Spider-Man saw his next starring role, he made a short cameo as a boss character in The Revenge of Shinobi on Sega Genesis. In the earliest version of the game, the Spider-Man-looking character was a shapeshifter who would transform into a Batman-like character once defeated. In later versions, Batman was removed entirely, leaving Spider-Man as the sole character you'd fight. Unfortunately, this licensing agreement was only temporary and actually prevented the game from re-releasing for years. In fact, it wasn't until 2009 that the Wii's Virtual Console got a version of the game that swapped Spidey's classic red for pink. The 90s saw Spider-Man video games flourish with over a dozen releases, not counting the various Capcom fighting games he appeared in as a playable character. In 1990, there were 3. The first was The Amazing Spider-Man, where Spider-Man is tasked with rescuing his beloved Mary Jane from the shape-shifting Mysterio. The entire game is set at a movie studio, so you'll come across less conventional Spider-Man enemies like robots and mummies. The second game released in 1990 was a Game Boy version of the first. It's a basic side-scrolling beat-em-up that follows a similar story as its PC counterpart. Mysterio has kidnapped Mary Jane, but as you quickly learn, he's not the only one behind her disappearance. You'll also have to fight characters such as the Hobgoblin, Scorpion, and Venom. 1990 was capped off with The Amazing Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin, which released on the Sega Master System that year and later came to the Genesis in 1991, the Game Gear in 1992, and the Sega CD in 1993. All 4 versions were side-scrolling action games. The Master System and Game Gear versions were nearly identical to each other, which makes sense as the console and handheld share much of the same hardware. Now, when Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin released on the Genesis, it was a huge hit. Critics praised its superior graphics and faithful recreations of the characters and universe. Spider-Man could even take pictures for the Daily Bugle to make more money for WebFluid. And according to developer Randall B. Rice, the game was owned by more than 2/3 of Sega Genesis owners. The Sega CD version, however, brought much more to the table, with faster gameplay, new levels, and fully voiced animated cutscenes.
Mary Jane.
Hi, Tiger.
Hi, honey. What's up?
I was just on my way to the studio to tape today's episode of Secret Hospital. Thought I'd stop by and get a kiss. If you're not too busy, of course.
Now there's something I'm never too busy for.
It also featured a more non-linear format and collectible comic books. However, the photography mechanic was removed. In both the Genesis and Sega CD versions of the game, there are alternate endings depending on how you beat the Kingpin. The Sega CD gets 2 cutscenes, one in which Spider-Man beats the Kingpin but fails to save Mary Jane, and another that has both Spider-Man and Mary Jane lowered into a pit of acid. The Genesis, on the other hand, features an ending where Mary Jane dies and Spider-Man is left to mourn. Of course, you could always just save her in either version. Now, between the release of the Genesis and Sega CD versions of Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin, we got 4 more games. Once again developed by Sega, Spider-Man the video game hit arcades in 1991 and featured 4-player beat-em-up action. One player gets to control the webhead himself, while others can choose between Black Cat, Hawkeye, and Namor the Submariner. Critics gave glowing reviews. Dragon Magazine gave it a 5 out of 5, Sinclair user called it one of the best superhero games, and Computer and Video Games Magazine praised its gameplay and huge, beautifully animated sprites. In 1992, a sequel to The Amazing Spider-Man on Game Boy hit the handheld, and a game called Spider-Man Return of the Sinister Six released on the NES and Master System. Return of the Sinister Six is a pretty straightforward side-scroller, though the Master System version is considerably easier than that on the NES. The Master System featured reworked platform jumps, items moved to more easily reachable places, and bosses that would not regenerate health. And once again, the Game Gear received a version that was almost identical to the Master System's. 1992 finished things off with the SNES version of Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge. The Genesis version released a year later in 1993, but both versions are very similar side-scrolling action games. The player controls Spider-Man, who must collect and disarm all of the bombs in the first level before moving on and discovering that the villainous Arcade has captured Wolverine, Storm, Gambit, and Cyclops. From this point forward, the player must play through each character's levels before facing off against Arcade in a final battle with Spider-Man. 1993 also saw the end of the Game Boy trilogy with The Amazing Spider-Man 3 Invasion of the Spider Slayers. It was another side-scrolling action game that didn't stray too far from its predecessors. The next few years were dominated by games that only released on the SNES and Genesis. First up was 1994's Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage, which is perhaps the most well-known Spidey game from this era. It's a single-player side-scrolling beat-em-up that, for the first time, let you play as Spider-Man's on-again, off-again enemy, Venom, in addition to the red and blue hero, of course. You could also summon various other Marvel heroes with items found in each level. The game was based on the 14-part run Maximum Carnage and features a story told with art from those comics. The story goes like this. The Carnage symbiote hiding within serial killer Cletus Cassidy helps him escape from prison. He teams up with Shriek, who he escapes and discovers Doppelganger with, and, well, you see, Doppelganger is an evil clone of Spider-Man that was made during the Infinity War arc, and actually, you know what? To avoid going down a crazy comic book rabbit hole, it's easier just to say Spider-Man and Venom versus Carnage and other villains. Now, while Maximum Carnage stayed pretty faithful to the comic arc of the same name, it wasn't received favorably. EGM criticized the graphics and controls, calling them sloppy and mediocre. GamePro commented that all of the Genesis version's features were nearly identical to the Super Nintendo's, including the drawbacks that, quote, made this only an average SNES game. Maximum Carnage was followed by a sequel called Venom/Spider-Man Separation Anxiety, which released on SNES, Genesis, and PC in 1995. It introduced 2-player co-op and featured both Venom and Spider-Man going after Carnage once again. Unfortunately, it was met similarly with a less than positive critical reception. EGM said it, quote, isn't much fun, while Next Generation criticized it for not being different enough from Maximum Carnage. Next Generation also noted that while the PC port was accurate, it lacked, quote, the intricacy and depth possible in a PC game. Now, a Japan-only game called The Amazing Spider-Man Lethal Foes also released in 1995 on the Super Famicom. Like many games before it, it was a side-scrolling action game that featured Spidey and many of his classic villains. However, Western regions weren't left empty-handed. 1995 also saw Spider-Man the Animated Series hit the SNES and Genesis. Based on the cartoon that premiered just a year earlier, each console got its own version. Both were side-scrolling action games, but that's where the similarities stop. Each version has its own unique art style and animations. The Genesis version also had one fewer level than the SNES, but regardless of these differences, both games were panned for their animation, sound, and gameplay. Now, Spider-Man closed out its 90s video game stint with The Amazing Spider-Man Web of Fire for the Sega 32X in 1996. It had the unfortunate fate of releasing after Sega had announced it was dropping support for the 32X, so this game was largely ignored. The only notable review was by GamePro, which called its gameplay decent and said that it won't disappoint Marvel fans, though it doesn't raise Spidey to the pantheon of great video game heroes. The 90s weren't kind to gamers wanting a quality Spider-Man adventure. It was a decade of games that left players wanting for something that accurately represented the hero and also provided an engaging experience. For the next 4 years, you could only find Spider-Man in those Capcom fighting games I mentioned earlier. The web-swinging hero was captured quite well in Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and the Marvel vs. Capcom games. He swung, punched, shot webs, and, like every Marvel character in those games, called out every move he did as he performed them. In fact, due to his playful and joking manner, I could actually see Spider-Man saying things like Webball and Maximum Spider during one of his actual fights in the comics, so it doesn't seem too out of character. And while these fighting games are beloved by many, none of them were the villain-packed adventures that fans longed for. Thankfully, it wouldn't be too long before Spider-Man finally got a game fans could be proud of.
One for JJ.
Much like the 90s, Spider-Man games were not hard to come by in the 2000s, but things did start taking a turn in the right direction. This was the decade when Activision took over the franchise, and the publisher's first shot was handed over to Neversoft, which is most well known for the Tony Hawk series. At this point, Neversoft was hot off the heels of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and as a matter of fact, that game's engine was used to make Spider-Man for the PS1, N64, Dreamcast, and PC.
Who dares? Face me, coward! Face a worthy foe! Spider-Man?
Last time I checked, I was Spider-Man.
The game's story follows Spider-Man after he's framed for stealing equipment from a reformed Dr. Otto Octavius, who you may know as Dr. Octopus. Eddie Brock tried to take photographs of the incident, but the imposter Spider-Man destroyed his camera before he could make any use of them. Enter Venom. Spider-Man must clear his name, beating up classic villains like the Scorpion, Rhino, and the Lizard. Of course, Venom plays a pretty big part as well, kidnapping Mary Jane and later playing the unlikely ally.
The Venom Marathon continues on the biggest TV in New York. We're shouting out to the whole big rotten apple here, people.
Sad thing is, he'll probably get his own talk show for this.
The game featured the vocal talents of Spider-Man Unlimited stars Reno Romano and Jennifer Hale, in addition to narration by Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee.
Welcome, true believers and newcomers alike. Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee here. Once again, we find our hero Peter Parker, better known around the world as the Amazing Spider-Man, in a heap of trouble.
This was the first Spider-Man game to not only include fully 3D levels and gameplay, but also pre-rendered cutscenes using the in-game models. These cutscenes appeared on the PS1, Dreamcast, and PC versions, while the N64 had comic book-style freeze frames with less spoken dialogue. This was because of the console's technical limitations, but thankfully that version of the game was no slouch in the gameplay department. Players controlled Spider-Man as they infiltrated areas taken over by crooks, symbiotes, and other baddies. Both stealth and hand-to-hand combat could be utilized to take on enemies, and Spidey's webs weren't exclusive to tying up victims. You could also shoot impact webbing to knock out foes, create web gloves to add extra oomph to your punches, and create a cocoon-like shield that explodes, taking out anyone nearby. Several Marvel characters like Daredevil, Punisher, and Captain America made cameos, and there were even alternate costumes based on Spider-Man's history, all of which you could wear at any point in the game. And best of all, critics loved it. GameSpot's own review said it was an excellent framework on which to base future Spider-Man games, and an exceptional game to boot, while PC Gamer called it the PC's best superhero game. There was also a Game Boy Color version of the game, though that one wasn't nearly as popular. As for the console version, Neversoft had finally cracked the code on how to make an excellent Spider-Man game that captured both the characters and their universe, in addition to providing an excellent gameplay experience. Unfortunately, however, the developer wouldn't get a second shot. With the growing popularity of the Tony Hawk series, Neversoft devoted its time to skateboarding. Spider-Man would make an appearance in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 as a secret playable character, but that was the extent of Neversoft's history with the red and blue hero. The sequel was handed over to Vicarious Visions, which worked on the Game Boy Color version of the previous game. Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro released exclusively for the PlayStation in 2001 and was largely similar to 2000's Spider-Man, though it did feature levels set in the New York streets, which were previously clouded by fog. Like the previous game, it featured a ton of unlockable costumes, in addition to a Create a Spider mode that let players create their own. However, Enter Electro had a smaller variety of enemies, mostly consisting of thugs and robots. It still had its fair share of cameos though, with the game's training mode featuring X-Men characters Rogue and Professor X.
Well, Spider-Man, I see you've decided to take advantage of Beast's offer to train in our state-of-the-art danger room.
The Mighty Thor was also set to make a cameo near the end of the game, but changes made after the September 11th attacks in New York removed him entirely. References to the Twin Towers were removed, cutscenes were altered, and the location of the final battle was changed. The final game still has a reference to Thor, however, as the Daily Bugle wrote that the God of Thunder defeated Electro and not Spider-Man. Unfortunately, critical reception was a bit mixed, with many critics scoring it lower than its predecessor. GameSpot's review called it somewhat disappointing and short, though it noted that diehard webheads will no doubt complete the game several times to unlock everything. The same year brought a Game Boy Color sequel called Spider-Man 2 The Sinister Six that was developed by Taurus Games. A Game Boy Advance game called Spider-Man Mysterio's Menace was also released, and both games received generally positive reviews. While Spider-Man video games and comics were commonplace during this time, the popular 90s animated series ended in 1998, and 1999's short-lived Unlimited series only lasted 13 episodes. Spider-Man hadn't exactly been in the mainstream public consciousness for quite some time. That all changed in 2002, when the first movie in director Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy hit theaters. These films helped kick off the superhero movie boom of the 2000s, which eventually led to Marvel launching its now popular cinematic universe. And of course, with great popularity comes great Spider-Man merchandising, including many more video games. A year prior to the first movie's launch, Activision acquired the rights to make video games based on the film franchise that at the time was still in production. Interestingly enough, future Call of Duty developer Treyarch was also acquired that year. However, before the studio would get a crack at first-person shooters, it was tasked with our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Alongside the movie, another game simply called Spider-Man was released. It was based on the movie and featured the vocal talents of Tobey Maguire and Willem Dafoe, both of whom reprised their roles.
So you must be Quilt Man, Padded Pete, Mr. Triple Ply? Oh, I've got it. The Cushion.
It played similarly to the previous two console-based Spider-Man games, with action set in specific levels. Some of the levels take place inside buildings, while others find you swinging through New York City. While it was based on the movie, it did include villains not featured in the film like the Vulture and Kraven the Hunter. In fact, the inclusion of non-movie villains would continue in every game based on these movies. 2002's Spider-Man was generally well received by critics, though one developer at Treyarch was unhappy with an important aspect of the red and blue hero. That developer was Jamie Freestrom, and as a longtime Spider-Man fan, the swinging in this first game left him wanting. I sat down for an interview with Freestrom, and he told me that he felt Spider-Man 1's swinging was anemic, and felt more like flying than actual swinging. One big thing was that the webs didn't actually attach to any buildings. This gave him an idea for something better. His His idea was to create a physics-based system that would allow the player to swing Spider-Man as if he was on a pendulum. He went into work after hours to adjust the game's code, and after a couple weeks of prototyping, he showed his idea to people around Treyarch. Some loved it, some hated it, but Freestrom's bosses asserted that the studio had to finish the game and not change direction mid-swing. Freestrom said he thought this was fair. At the time, the higher-ups at Treyarch were burned by games that featured key mechanics based on physics. A previous Treyarch game called Die by the Sword had physics-based sword fighting, and while the controls were difficult to get a handle on, critics praised the gameplay. However, its sales weren't great. Treyarch was also turned down for Sean Palmer's Pro Snowboarder, as the studio had pitched a more physics-based approach to the snowboarding gameplay, something Freestrom said was unplayable. At this point, the studio wanted to keep physics at an arm's length. Now, with the first Spider-Man movie game's good reviews and sales, development moved forward on the follow-up. This time, Freestrom was asked to lead development. However, he gave Treyarch an ultimatum.
Well, I kind of held the company just a slight bit hostage because I said, I only want to be the lead on Spider-Man 2 if we get to, keep working on the swinging system that I prototyped for Spider-Man 1 that we didn't use. I don't want the job unless we can, give my idea a fair shake. And they said, all right. And we made that deal.
Freestrom told me that game development at the time was big on creating huge design documents before starting work. However, he pushed for a large prototyping period at the beginning of Spider-Man 2, with a focus on creating specific game mechanics that would lead into a larger game. At this point, he still had to prove the physics-based swinging, or else Treyarch would force him to continue forward with what was established in the first game. Freestrom and his team worked diligently to make the swinging work. He said that at the time, video games were normally pretty easy to learn and figure out, which made creating a more complicated swinging system even more difficult. Focus groups weren't able to figure it out in their short 15-minute sessions, which sent Treyarch back to flesh it out. The team ultimately landed on a system that would let you shoot out a web with a shoulder button, swing with the analog stick, and jump out of it with a face button. And for those wanting a less involved experience, Treyarch implemented an easy swing mode that only required the use of a single button. Freestrom stressed that without the help of his colleagues from animators to coders, the swinging would never have come to fruition. In fact, Treyarch refined the swinging for almost the entire development period, right up until the discs were pressed and sent out for launch. In addition to the swinging, Treyarch created a new combat system. It includes an uppercut that sends enemies into the air, with Spider-Man following quickly behind to deliver more punishment. It also featured Spidey Sense, which alerted the player of an incoming attack, giving them enough time to push a button to perform a quick dodge. And of course, after development finished, Freestrom and his team were nervous about how the game would be received. However, much to their delight, it was met with positive reviews. Spider-Man 2 launched for PS2, Xbox, and GameCube in 2004, and despite the repetitive side missions like pizza delivery, critics were in love with how it made them feel like Spider-Man.
Hey Parker, I have pizzas waiting to be delivered to customers because you weren't here. Hurry and deliver these, and don't mess things up.
You got it, Mr. Aziz.
Our own review called it a success for capturing the sheer thrill of web swinging through a metropolitan area. Even today, Spider-Man 2 is often thought of by fans and critics alike as the best Spider-Man game ever released. Well, at least on consoles, as the PC got its own version that was considerably dumbed down, and even received a 25 out of 100 from PC Gamer. Needless to say, Freestrom and his team were successful with their risky swinging system. With the critical and commercial success of Spider-Man 2, Treyarch was cemented as the Spider-Man studio. However, Freestrom did not provide significant work on any forthcoming Treyarch games. He told me that he became disenfranchised with working at the company. The founders had been let go, his friends were getting laid off, and then an opportunity to work with Magic the Gathering creator Richard Garfield came up. That was more than enough for Freestrom to pass on developing another Spider-Man game, despite his love for the character. Next up was 2005's Ultimate Spider-Man, which continued without Freestrom or the swinging system that the team had worked so hard on. This game took a more cartoony approach with cel-shaded graphics and a heavy comic book style. The game was based on the Ultimate Marvel universe, which featured some changes to the characters fans had come to know and love. The important parts to know is that Peter Parker is still Spider-Man and Eddie Brock is still Venom. In fact, the game has players control both Spider-Man and Venom for different parts of the story and retains the open world formula started in Spider-Man 2. There are even moments where you'll race the Human Torch as Spider-Man and fight Wolverine as Venom.
That's my bike you smashed this place up with. What are you supposed to be, anyway?
I'm the best at what I do.
Ultimate Spider-Man received positive reviews, with GameSpot's praising the comic book-inspired look, excellent boss fights, and good voice acting and writing. However, our review criticized the race and chase portions in addition to the small number of story missions. Versions for the Game Boy Advance and DS were also released. 2007 brought a close to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movie trilogy, and with it came another licensed game. Spider-Man 3 had big shoes to fill after the very successful Spider-Man 2, and it was also the first time Spider-Man would appear on the PS3 and 360. Now, while it did retain the core of its predecessor's swinging system, there were a few things missing. In fact, Spider-Man 3's swing mechanics were closer to Spider-Man 2's easy swing mode, only requiring the use of a single button, as opposed to the multiple button system that Freestrom and his team had created. Unfortunately, as a whole, it was not much of a step forward, and is perhaps best remembered for its unintentionally hilarious QuickTime events.
Help! Please! Someone! I'm going to die!
GameSpot's own review said that, at best, it was a step sideways for the Spider-Man movie games. Now, with the rising popularity of Activision's Call of Duty series and Treyarch's fate as one of the franchise's core developers, 2008 marked the year the studio would make its final Spider-Man game. Web of Shadows released that year on PS3, Xbox 360, Wii, PSP, PS2, DS, and PC. It's once again set in an open-world Manhattan and features a plot based heavily around Venom and the symbiote, which has infested New York City. This game's key difference is a morality system that poses choices throughout the game: the red and blue path versus the black symbiote path. This results in different story moments based on your decisions, such as teaming up with heroic characters or more villainous ones. Some of the familiar faces you'll come across include Luke Cage, Moon Knight, and Wolverine, the latter of which you'll end up fighting in quite the memorable battle after he's consumed by a symbiote. Despite these good or bad choices, you won't get locked out of playing with either costume. You can switch between the two whenever you like, and each has their own gameplay differences. Classic Spider-Man favors speed, but if you want to deal in more strength, then the black suit is for you. The action is actually quite similar to past games in that it's very combo-based. The now classic uppercut into the air returns, as well as a bunch of other new moves. Web-based attacks let you close the distance between you and your opponents, while the black suit also lets you take advantage of the symbiote tendrils to deal more damage. Now, as for actually swinging through the city, Web of Shadows abandoned the idea of having your webs attached to buildings. And while you can unrealistically swing above the game's skyscrapers, critics still praise the swinging for its great feel. GameSpot's review called it tremendously liberating, noting that some of the most thrilling moments in the game are when you utilize Web of Shadows' sense of speed and swing in pursuit of villains. And while Web of Shadows certainly has its fans, not all of the reviews were positive. As a matter of fact, the reception was quite mixed. Many outlets criticized the story, shallow morality system, and repetitive nature. The PS3 and 360 versions both sit at a Metacritic average of less than 70, while the PS2 and PSP 2D side-scrolling action was compared to Spider-Man games of old, but not in an entirely favorable way. Now, Treyarch's removal from the Spider-Man series probably had more to do with Call of Duty's growing popularity, but with 5 games under the studio's belt, it was about time for a new developer to take a swing at a red and blue hero. Beenox, a studio that was at the time best known for its port work, took the lead on Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, which released on Xbox 360, PS3, and PC in 2010. The main concept behind this game was being able to play as 4 different Spider-Men from 4 different dimensions.
Say your prayers, punks. Here comes the Spider-Man.
Leaving open worlds behind, Shattered Dimensions adopted a level-based structure with unique mechanics for each dimension. The 4 Spider-Men were the classic Amazing Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2099, Ultimate Spider-Man, and Spider-Man Noir.
Get that kid over, you lousy jerks.
On top of that, each of them was portrayed by a different voice actor from Spider-Man's past. Neil Patrick Harris played Amazing Spider-Man, Dan Gilvezan voiced 2099, Josh Keaton was Ultimate, and Christopher Daniel Barnes took the role of Noir. Shattered Dimensions kind of left web swinging behind, putting a greater focus on platforming and combat that could be compared to the God of War series. Amazing Spider-Man is pretty much what you'd expect from the character at this point, taking on a style similar to a comic book. The 2099 levels put a greater focus on aerial combat and an accelerated vision mode which slows down everything around you. The Ultimate sections are similar to Amazing Spider-Man's, though instead of web-based attacks, Ultimate takes advantage of the Venom symbiote suit and a rage mode that temporarily enhances his strength. And last but definitely not least is Spider-Man Noir, which is the most unique of the 4 dimensions. The action and platforming found in the other 3 is present here as well, but they take a backseat to stealth. You need to stick to the shadows to stay hidden, represented by the entire world turning black and white. The stealth is pretty basic, however, as being caught is, for the most part, easily rectified by stepping back into the shadows. Each level features a different Spider-Man villain or character you'll end up fighting. Of course, this means that it'll be a different take on that classic character depending on which dimension they appear in. That means that while Kraven the Hunter stays true to himself in the Amazing universe, Deadpool will appear as his Ultimate version, and characters like Vulture and Goblin will be creepier than ever in the Noir universe. This new approach to Spider-Man seemed to work. Shattered Dimensions was met with a positive critical reception, with many critics praising the various worlds and gameplay styles. GamePro even called the game one of Spider-Man's best. While the high point for many was the Noir universe, GameSpot's review viewed it a little differently. Critic Chris Waters said that anyone who enjoyed last year's Batman Arkham Asylum is likely to look at Noir as a shameless, not-so-successful imitation of that game's stellar stealth. In fact, most superheroes were now in the shadow of Batman Arkham Asylum, which was a standout character-defining game that defied fans' expectations of how good licensed games could actually be. Many fans started to wonder when Spider-Man would get his Arkham Asylum. Regardless, Shattered Dimensions was well received, pushing Activision to make Beenox the new Spider-Man studio. In fact, the developer would release a follow-up to Shattered Dimensions the very next year. In 2011's Spider-Man Edge of Time continued the conceit of different Spider-Man universes but pared the game down to 2, Amazing Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2099. Edge of Time featured nearly identical gameplay but with a more focused story about changing the past to affect the future. The Spider-Man voice actors also got shaken up a bit. This time, Josh Keaton played the Amazing version and Christopher Daniel Barnes voiced 2099. In the story, a scientist named Walker Sloan travels back in time to found a 2099 corporation named Alchemax in the 1970s, turning present-day New York into a bit of a dystopia. Amazing Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2099 work together to undo these changes. Unfortunately, Edge of Time found itself receiving mixed reviews. GameSpot enjoyed its story, but found that while the Spider-Man's differing personalities offered a nice contrast, the gameplay was too similar and too simple to be fun. Game Informer's review called Edge of Time a major step back from the formula that worked. 2011 was also the year a 4th Spider-Man film by Sam Raimi was supposed to release. However, those plans fell through and it was decided that Sony's Columbia Pictures would instead reboot the film series with a brand new cast and story. Activision continued to own the rights to develop Spider-Man video games, so with Edge of Time's poor reception behind it, Beenox refocused with the video game adaptation of 2012's The Amazing Spider-Man. Perhaps trying to recapture the spirit of the previous movie games, Beenox took its first shot at an open-world game. To improve Spider-Man's mobility, Beenox implemented a new feature called Web Rush, which allows you to view the world around you in first person and select a specific destination. Once your mark is set, the action zooms back to Spider-Man as he performs an acrobatic feat to reach your desired spot. In addition to the new improvements to traversal, the combat was also overhauled. Taking cues from Arkham Asylum, Spider-Man featured a similar system that allowed players to counter attacking foes at the press of a button. And as for the story, it was set after the events of the movie it was based on, continuing with the cross-species experimentation of Dr. Kurt Connors. With many of Spider-Man's classic villains being based on animals, it made for an interesting new take on the character. The plot of the video game is separate from that of the actual movies, but this concept was eventually explored in the movie's sequel. Now, while the critical reception was generally positive, perhaps the biggest disappointment critics had was that the open world in The Amazing Spider-Man acts as more of a hub with side activities than what you'd normally find in an open world game. What I mean by this is that all of the game's story missions take you into confined environments, away from what people love most about these games, swinging through a big open world. With an Amazing Spider-Man movie sequel scheduled for 2014, another licensed game was set to follow, with Beenox once again in the developer's seat. However, this would be the last Activision-published Spider-Man game. In early 2014, Activision and Marvel's partnership ended, eventually leading to all of Activision's Marvel games getting pulled from digital stores. That included all of the Spider-Man games in addition to some of the other Marvel titles like Deadpool. Amidst this, Activision confirmed that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 would still release later that year. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was the first game in the series to release on the current generation of consoles, the PS4 and Xbox One. Like its prequel, it's also set in an open world, but this time it takes greater advantage of it. The swinging now requires you to attach to buildings and even features its own unique system, utilizing both triggers as Spider-Man's two arms. Left trigger shoots a web from his left side, while right shoots it from, well, his right. More missions now take place within the world as well, and while there are times you do go indoors, players have more options to approach certain situations, including stealth. Prior to launch, Beenox seemed to be making the right decisions to improve upon the first game and deliver a more engaging experience. Unfortunately, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 didn't stick the landing. It was Beenox's most negatively received Spider-Man game, receiving a Metacritic average of around 50 out of 100. As was the case with almost every Spider-Man game since the early 2000s, GameSpot's review praised the movement and web swinging, but only when staying in motion. Coming to a stop to grab a collectible or run up a wall would often have you clip through walls, causing the camera to jitter and shake. Eurogamer criticized its technical shoddiness, Polygon was disappointed by its poor execution, and IGN lamented the quality of the game's story. GamesRadar's review called the game enjoyable, but said it doesn't innovate in any way and feels like an early previous-gen title at best. And thus was the end of Activision's relationship with Spider-Man, a characteristic history of annual releases with its fair share of ups and downs. And with Marvel being owned by Disney and the uprising of the proverbial cash cows that are mobile games, not many had confidence in the company investing in expensive AAA console games. Enter E3 2016. Despite only being 2 years since the last game, it felt like Spider-Man was finally back and returning to his roots. This time, however, Spider-Man would be published by Sony Interactive Entertainment and developed by Insomniac Games, the latter of which is best known for Sunset Overdrive and the Ratchet & Clank games. We didn't get to see much gameplay of the PS4 exclusive, though Insomniac confirmed that the trailer was in-game and running on the basic PS4, not the Pro, which had yet to be revealed at the time. When real gameplay was finally shown, fans were blown away. We saw Spider-Man swinging, moving through the air with ease, sneaking around, taking out baddies with web gadgets, punching them into the air, hitting them with stuff in the environment, saving this guy from falling to his death, and so much more. The gameplay reveal closed out with a closer look at the game's main antagonist, Mr. Negative, a little-known villain that debuted in 2008's Brand New Day comic book storyline. At the time, it was unclear if Spider-Man would face off against any of his classic baddies, as Mr. Negative was the only character in sight. But with time came the reveal of 4 of his most iconic villains: Electro, Rhino, Scorpion, and Vulture, who all seem to be working alongside Mr. Negative. Now, we're just weeks away from playing it ourselves. It's a brand new story set in Insomniac's own Spider-Man universe, where our hero is already quite the experienced crime fighter. But not only are you controlling the webhead in costume, there's also ample time spent as Peter Parker in his quieter moments, spending time with family and friends, as well as his job, working on science experiments. Of course, with a huge return to Spider-Man, I can't forget about the web swinging. It's actually quite similar to Spider-Man 2 in that you'll need a building, the R2 trigger, and the X button. Yes, you press R2, a web shoots to the nearest building, and then you press X to jump out of your swing before starting all over again. Our preview called the web swinging instantly satisfying, but added that it's wonderful to see that there's more to the game than just Spider-Man's day job. Spider-Man has grown as video games themselves have grown. He's gone from slowly climbing up a building and typing in the word punch to actually punching enemies and swinging through a virtual Manhattan. For a long time, fans were in search of the game that made them truly feel like a web-swinging hero, and when one of those fans went on to develop a system that allowed for such an experience, it would set a bar for every game to follow. Spider-Man 2 cast a shadow over the franchise with its open world and physics-based swinging, each subsequent game unable to crawl away from comparison. Over the past 14 years, fans have longed for a game to surpass it. After looking back at Spider-Man's history, it feels fitting to see such an ambitious AAA Spider-Man game return to the traditions that fans have waited years to rediscover. How it fares, however, well, we'll just have to wait and see. Until then, I'm sure all you true believers out there have your fingers crossed for something special.
The web slinger.
Hard to resist doing aerial acrobatics.
Thank you
but
very
the pizza
much.
won't survive if I'm not careful.
Just in time, man. I'm starving.
That's it for the pizza. Now to get back and return the bag.